Good evening. I'm Thomas Canavan, the Executive Director of the National Law Enforcement Museum. This month marks the 40th anniversary of the crash of Air Florida Flight 90 and the rescue of 5 lives from the icy Potomac River thanks to the creative heroism of the United States Park Police. A key component of that rescue is the helicopter you see behind me, known as Eagle One. This Bell 206L1 helicopter was the first artifact installed during our construction and is the first thing many visitors see upon entering the museum. For many, however, the role of aviation in law enforcement is often overlooked, so we think it's time to turn the spotlight on those guardians in the air. In today's program, we'll try to understand what happened 40 years ago and how U.S. Park Police aviation today looks different as a result. Be sure to stay tuned through to the end of our program for some extra content, a rare flyover of some of downtown DC with an extra special treat of seeing the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial and Museum from the air. I want to thank our generous sponsor, Russ Matthews, who has supported not only today's program, but whose family's foundation has been a key supporter in bringing the restored Eagle One to our museum. We also want to thank the United States Park Police for their partnership and support in making this program possible. Thanks also to everyone watching today's program and for taking the time to join us. If you find value in programs like this and want to help us continue to tell the stories of American law enforcement, please take 30 seconds to make a donation to the museum by texting programs 2022 to 41444. It takes just a moment and will make a real difference. To get us started, I'd like to introduce Pamela A. Smith, Chief of the United States Park Police. Chief Smith is a 23-year veteran of the service. Starting as a patrol officer, she rose through the ranks to become only the second woman to lead this 230-year-old agency. Chief Smith, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Thomas, and good evening. My name is Pamela A. Smith, Chief of Police for the United States Park Police, a unit of the National Park Service. I am humbled to address everyone tonight as the head of the nation's oldest uniform federal law enforcement agency with a long and proud 231-year history. It gives me a sense of pride to have the honor of acknowledging the heroic efforts of our Eagle One flight crew, pilot Don Usher and paramedic rescue tech Melvin Jean Windsor, who responded to the scene of the Air Florida Flight 90 crash on January 13, 1982, after it lost altitude, crashing into the 14th Street Bridge and plummeting into the Potomac River. The heroic and valiant efforts displayed by our crew, the bystanders, and our agency partners resulted in the rescue of 5 survivors. Our hearts still go out to the families of the 78 souls who lost their lives that day. Tonight, you will hear from others who will give a firsthand account of what occurred on that day. But you will also hear from our current United States Park Police pilots who will provide a more in-depth perspective of the technical pieces of equipment that we use today during our rescue missions. The present-day missions of the United States Park Police Aviation Unit include aviation support for our local law enforcement partners, medevac, search and rescue, high-risk prisoner transport, and presidential and dignitary security. The Aviation Unit has provided accident-free professional aviation services for over 48 years. This is primarily due to the dedication of the flight crews, the support from within and outside of the U.S. Park Police, and the state-of-the-art equipment used in the performance of their missions. I would like to thank the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund and Museum for our long-standing relationship and for tonight highlighting the heroic efforts of our pilots over 48 years ago. I would also like to thank you for also acknowledging the current role that we, the United States Park Police, play in the greater Washington, D.C. area. This relationship is vital towards fostering a constructive dialogue that helps to build strong relationships between law enforcement and the communities we serve.
Thank you, Chief Smith. The crash of Air Florida Flight 90 40 years ago was a surreal and tragic day that many here in Washington, D.C. still remember. Not only was there the loss of life due to the plane crash, but a fatal train derailment on the metro system, combined with a terrible snowstorm, made it a day for the ages. Thanks to the United States Park Police, on the very day of the 40th anniversary, we recreated the rescue flight from the Park Police hangar to the 14th Street Bridge and the site of the crash in the Potomac River. Flying around DC is a carefully controlled and restricted endeavor, and we're especially excited to share this unique experience with you right now. So let's take a closer look at that day to understand what it was like. In addition to the flight, we'll hear several perspectives to help set the scene, and we'll hear more details about the rescue itself. Look for stories from Steve Souter, who was on dispatch that day with the DC Fire Department, Lynn Herring, who was then chief of the United States Park Police, Chester Panzer, who famously recorded footage of the harrowing helicopter rescue, and Don Usher, previously recorded for a museum oral history project, who piloted Eagle One and helped save 5 lives that day.
Well, I was aware of what ended up being a little bit conflicting information because it was identified the carrier's name, Eastern Airline, was mentioned, and certain things like that. So you were trying to resolve those discrepancies in your head, but clearly you knew a horrible, horrible thing had happened because an airliner had definitely crashed. There was no doubt about that. It was in the midst of a roaring blizzard. It was in the midst of rush hour traffic with gridlock all over the city of Washington. It occurred when it was very, very challenging for the fire department to make its way to the scene of the event. Keep in mind, this was on almost the Virginia shoreline of the Potomac River. And for those that may not be familiar, in Washington, D.C. owns all of the Potomac River. It's part of the District of Columbia. So the responsibility for the response was the District of Columbia Fire Department. But it was absolutely at the far extreme edge of its response area, which made getting there more challenging in time and certainly more weather to encounter along the way. And with the traffic being what it was, every minute that passed by, the traffic congestion only got worse. So your problem of responding to the event was getting worse by the moment.
Well, it was a very difficult day because actually we had, as I recall, approximately 2 feet of snow, and was still coming down very heavily. At that particular time, some of my people had gone home. I'm talking about the higher command, some of my deputy chiefs, but my photographer, Charlie Pereira, came into my office and told me that, asked if I needed anything. I said, I don't think so. And about that time, when I answered him, the police radio announced that Air Florida 90 had just crashed into the 14th Street Bridge. As a result of that, we both said, oh my God. And Charlie, being a photographer, he had his camera and backpack and all. He says, well, everything is totally gridlocked with traffic. He says, I'm going to jog across the bridge and take some still photographs. So he did that. He left in the cold, blazing cold, and he went over to take photographs. And about the same time, I'm getting a phone call from my Anacostia helicopter wing. My pilot, Don Usher, called, and the paramedic, Gene Windsor, was with him. And they said, Chief, we want to try to go do the rescue. And I said to them, I said, well, my goodness, I said, no one. I said, the military won't let their helicopter take off. Over Marine One, they won't. Nobody. The Metropolitan had a smaller helicopter than we had, but they wouldn't let theirs take off either. And to be very honest, in my general orders that guided the operation of the helicopter, stated that with the visibility the way it was, you should not take off. And so I was in a big predicament. I knew there was a great need. They wanted to do it. And I thought to myself, well, this helicopter's worth millions of dollars that I just got from Congress. And if, number one, not that it was just a helicopter, if I lose the helicopter and it's against my own orders that I've signed, and no one else lets theirs go up. And besides, if I lose a trained pilot and a paramedic, 2 lives, my name is mud, and I'm going to be up before Congress testifying why I made such a stupid decision. I said to them, though, I said, after we discussed all of that, the problems, they said to me, Chief, we still want to do it. Well, that put the onus right back on me. There was no way of bypassing it. I had to make a decision. And I thought about it, but actually, if that was my mother or brother or someone, or my daughter that was out in that cold, freezing water and they could be saved, what would I want the chief to decide? And so I said, well, look, I'm not a pilot. So I said to Donnie, I said, what is the probability that this is feasible, that you can do it? He says, Chief, we want to do it. And he says, I think we can. He says, I flew some operations in Vietnam. So I said, if you feel that you have a decent chance of completing this mission, then God be with you and do your best.
I was working at WJLA TV as a news videographer at the time. I stayed there about 9 months after, and then eventually moved over to NBC, where I worked for 38 years. In those days, we were a 2-man crew, so there was a photographer and a sound man, and we used to bring our crew cars home with us with all our equipment. So I picked up my sound man, George Patterson. He lived in Arlington. I was living in Burke, Virginia at the time. And our first assignment, since it was snowing, it had snowed all through the night, and it was snowing that morning, was to shoot some snow video in Northern Virginia, and then to bring it into the station and have them air it in their noon news. It was snowing through the day. It was pretty treacherous going because a lot of the roads hadn't been plowed. There were enough people out there that you obviously had to be careful. We got around pretty well. After we shot the snow video in Arlington and brought it to the station in Northwest Washington, I think we took a lunch break, and after lunch, they sent us to Rockville for a working fire. Not long after that, we were dispatched to the airport, National Airport, with another reporter. So we got to the airport was closed. It was really crowded because there were no flights leaving, and people, I guess, were still coming to the airport expecting to fly away. All the other TV stations were there doing the same story. You know, the airport's closed, how long, how inconvenient, interview people. So we shot that story, maybe took us an hour. The assignment desk told George and I to go home, get some rest, and we're going to do the same snow drill the following day, meaning we would start really early and get more snow video, maybe do whatever stories were happening the next day. So George and I left the airport We drove about 3 or 4 miles, and we're on the GW Parkway in bumper to bumper traffic over near the Teddy Roosevelt Bridge. We were sitting in traffic for probably 45 minutes or so, listening to the radio, just making small talk. And we knew it was going to be a long time before we got to Arlington because no one was moving. It was still snowing. And there we were with a lot of people sitting in traffic. After like 45 minutes, the assignment desk called us on our two-way radio. This is before we had cell phones. Called us on the two-way radio, asked us where we were. And then we heard some conversation. They were trying to reach other crews and they were giving their locations. And then there was this radio silence. And a few minutes later, they called us back, asked us again where we were. We told them, sitting in traffic near the Teddy Roosevelt Bridge. And someone on the radio said, we heard something about a small plane crash at National Airport. Go check it out. So George and I looked at each other and I thought, oh, okay. So he turned the radio over to WTOP All News Radio, and they were already talking about Air Florida Palm 90 had crashed. So they already had it on their air. And George and I, our eyes must have gone as big as saucers, thinking, oh my God, this is real. So miraculously, the median strip on GW Parkway at that time had no guardrail. And I was able to maneuver the car up onto the median strip down on the other side of the parkway, heading back towards the airport. And one of the miraculous things that day, and there were several that happened that made the whole day kind of unbelievable. When I put the car down on the parkway going back towards the airport, there wasn't a single car on the road. It was just packed snow and there was no traffic. So George and I go speeding off, skidding down the road towards the airport, which again is probably about 3-4 miles away. As we're approaching the 14th Street Bridge, which is actually 3 bridges, we saw some flashing lights off to our left, our 11 o'clock position, which would have been towards the river. We saw fire, I think ambulance or something like that. Not a lot, just one. So we looked at each other and I stopped the car and we both agreed that we should stop and at least look in on what's going on there before we go to the airport. Because if we continued on down to the airport, we never would have gotten back to the accident scene because of all the traffic going the other direction. So I put the car up on the curb underneath the bridge to keep it protected out of the snow so we'd have a way out. You always need an escape route. And we grabbed our equipment and we went bounding through the snow, which was pretty deep. The grassy area probably had about a foot of snow on it up to our knees. And we went running over and we connected our gear together. And there was an ambulance there and we could see the lights flashing. And there were probably a good amount of civilians around on the river. And we could hear the helicopter. And that turned out to be the crash site. So we knew we were in the right place.
We actually left the hangar, went over to the police station across the field from us, into the Anacostia facility, and visited there for a couple of minutes, and then figured, well, we better go back over and see what's going to happen. We were contemplating calling and taking leave because of the way the snow just kept coming, and it was cold. I think it was about 24, 25 degrees, and the river was frozen, the snow was coming down. And right at, as you might imagine, unknown to us, at 4 o'clock, Palm 90, Air Florida, had finally gotten out onto the runway, took off, and after a very brief sojourn in the air, crashed into the inbound 14th Street Bridge and then went into the river. So they were looking for the aircraft. They even asked one of the aircraft coming in immediately behind Palm 90, would you go down to the end of the runway and see if you see a Boeing 737 down there? And the aircraft that went down to the end said, well, we see tracks all the way down to the overrun, and then all the snow's blown out of the way where they essentially jerked it off the runway, and it kind of, the jet thrust blew all the snow out of the way as it went off. At that point, somebody over in Washington National, and I believe it was in Departure, picked up the phone, called us over at the hangar. And this was probably about 10 after we got the call, and said, "Are you guys flying today?" And I laughed and said, "No." He said, "Well, what's up?" And they said, "We're missing an airplane, and it might be over in Roach's Run or somewhere up on that end." Now, Roach's Run, obviously our interest in Roach's Run is when the aircraft left on runway 36, which is where Palm 90 did, there's a water section right there, and then the George Washington Memorial Parkway, which is National Park Service property on the west side of the river. And to the east side is Potomac Park, which, once again, we're very interested in. So we ran out, started putting the aircraft together, and in an afterthought, grabbed a couple throw balls that had personal flotation devices inside of them. We'd used them before. It was a yellow softball sized thing, and you would throw it into the water, and when it hit the water would set off a charge which would inflate the PFD. So grabbed a couple of those, which probably there was already one or two in the aircraft, but we grabbed a couple more. And then we tried to get the aircraft outside, but with all that snow, our towmobile couldn't get out. Now here's where my paramedic comes in. Ron Gailey also did snowplow work on the side. He had a plow on the front of his truck. He plowed the ramp while we rolled the aircraft out. So Gene jumped in with me while he was putting his truck away. And he just waved us on because we had already started up. So he stayed at the hangar. Gene jumped in with me for what we considered probably was a no mission.
Reported an Eastern Airlines jet that crashed off the side of the 14th Street Bridge.
And the tower said, "Do not depart. The field is experiencing an emergency." And I said, "I'm aware of that. I'm responding to the emergency." And I said, "Okay, go ahead." So we took off. So as soon as we took off, we almost went into the clouds instantly coming off of the Eagle's Nest. I did a left turn, flew to South Capitol Street Bridge, flew across South Capitol Street Bridge just at a height above the lights so that I could maintain contact with the ground by looking through the chin bubble, looking between my feet, because looking straight ahead was nothing. It was just gray with the snow going by us. Flew up South Capitol Street Bridge to the Southwest Freeway, turned left. Everybody was stopped. No one was going anywhere. All the vehicles were stopped in all directions because they had just released all federal employees. So the whole place was just a traffic jam, but a lot of lights, which was good. A lot of lights for me to follow. So we flew down the Southwest Freeway, jumped over LaFont Plaza Bridge, came to the 14th Street Bridge, and Mother Nature cooperated and turned off the snow just for a moment, just for a couple moments. Our rescue equipment was the tow rope that pulled the helicopter in and out of the hangar. It was a rope that was about the size of my thumb with two metal clips on the end that we hooked on the front of the toes of the skids and pulled it in and out. That was our rescue equipment to that point. He took the throw balls, threw them in, the rotor wash blew them away immediately as soon as they inflated, off they went. So, okay, that didn't work. That didn't work like we thought it would. Gene dropped the rope to Bert Hamilton. He put it around himself. We lifted him out of the water, flew him, and as we came to the bank, there was a tree in the way. And an ambulance sitting right on the edge of the bank. So we're hovering right above the tree, and the firefighters pushed the tree over and dragged it out of the way so we could get in. And they had to find the driver of the ambulance and get him to move the ambulance back so we could actually hover over the ledge and the bank and have Bert Hamilton removed from the tow rope. So that took about 4 minutes of maneuvering and yelling on the loudspeaker and trying to, we were taking this as it came. So we dropped Bert off. He was fine. We turned, went back to the fuselage again. Gene dropped the rope. It was passed around, and then the next thing you know, Kelly Duncan, the stewardess, was the next on the rope. Now, what was scary, we later learned, was she didn't hook it around herself. She took the open rope and wrapped it under her arm twice, and the rope was hanging free. And the only thing that was holding her to the rope was it was hooked under her armpits. And somehow she kept her arms down without letting her arms go like that and the rope fly off of her. So we picked her up about 25 feet in the air and flew her to shore and dropped her off. Didn't know that she hadn't hooked the rope, that it was just wrapped around her. Like, whew. So while we were over there, Gene and I said, this is taking too long, one at a time. They've been in the water now a long time, but we got to speed this up. So we asked if they had any other equipment. And again, that radio, that mutual aid, no one was answering that radio. So I just gave up on the mutual aid, and we talked by loudspeaker with the people that were on the shoreline. I just used the helicopter loudspeaker, and they nodded yes or nodded no. And the next thing I know, they ran over with what's called a throw buoy that you would use, and the buoy was about this big around. It wasn't meant for a person to go through. It was meant for you to put your arms through with about, and I think it probably had about a 25-foot rope. They threw that up to us, so off we went. Gene tied it in. So now we had a throw buoy and a helicopter tow rope as our rescue equipment. But we needed to speed this up. We had 4 people left at the aircraft. One of them, all we ever saw was his face and his hands. That was Arlen Williams. The other 3, there was a man and 2 women still there. So we figured we got to speed this up. Joe Stiley took the ring buoy, put one arm through it and his head through it, but his shoulder was free. Priscilla Torado, he grabbed a hold of her, so he was just holding on to her. And then Patricia Felch grabbed the tow rope, but only by holding it with a bare hand. She held on for an astonishing amount of distance, considering she had a broken arm, a broken wrist, broken leg, internal injuries, and a puncture wound that caused almost her to lose her foot. They were in 29 degrees. So, the hypothermia issue was very real. It's astonishing they did what they did. I guess that will to survive kind of rides everything else. So we began a trip with 3, with Patricia Felch, Priscilla Torado being held on to by Joe Stiley. Joe Stiley halfway through a ring buoy that wasn't meant for you to go all the way inside of. Not surprisingly, it wasn't very long before Patricia Felch let go. As we got closer to shore, I had to lift a little bit, which put her, because of such a short rope, it started lifting her out of the water, and she actually stayed on that rope until she was at waist level with me lifting her across ice floes and things like that before she let go. The other astonishingly good thing that occurred was after they had all met around the fuselage, the stewardess, Kelly Duncan, found a personal flotation device, and put it on Patricia Felch. So when she fell off into open water, she was actually the only one with a PFD. If she had fallen off without the PFD, she would have drowned immediately. So she was waiting there for us. Joe held on to Priscilla, and as we got to shore, we had blown all that ice ahead of us, and we had now about 20 yards where we had to physically drag them through 3-inch thick ice floes. Joe held on to her all the way to the point where they were within 20 feet of shore, lost his grip on her. She, once again, ends up on an ice floe instead of going into open water. She ends up on an ice floe. We get Joe to the shore. We're yelling at them, speed it up, speed it up. We've got to get back here quickly. And we went immediately back to Priscilla because Patricia Felch was okay. She was floating. She had a PFD on. We began lifting her off of the ice floe, and she was holding on, but she only got about 10 feet and just kind of rotated, and her arms slid right out of the ring. And she rotated over onto her back and started going under. And Gene's yelling. Gene was ready to jump out of the aircraft. Of course, that meant if he jumped out of the aircraft, then I didn't have a rescue technician anymore, and he's going to be hypothermic. And we still got people to go. So right before that decision had to be made, what to do next, the water splashes, and out swims a guy in a blue shirt, swims out, grabs a hold of her, turns her over, just like a firefighter, rolls her over, swims her right back to shore again, turns her over to the firefighter standing on the shoreline. We thought it was a firefighter. It was just a guy who said, I wasn't going to stand there and watch her drown. There's no way that was going to happen. So he dove from the top of the bank in. Lenny Skutnik, yep. From the Congressional Budget Office, a clerk in the CV and the Congressional Budget Office. So now we're down to two. There's one at the fuselage. There's one floating in open water. So we turned, we went to her. Gene dropped her the rope. She said no. He told her to try and grab it again. She said no. She put her arm through it, but it pulled out right away. So said, okay, let's grab her, because I know we'd already done this before. The aviation section had been successful at water level snatches. So Gene said he was going to do that. So Gene got out of the aircraft, stood on the skid. He was not connected to anything in the aircraft but his helmet cord. So him and I talking, he was out there on his own, wedged his butt against the fuselage, put his feet in, and then I turned, and she was in the water, and I hovered right past her where I watched the skid go about that far from her head. So I could watch, and as she went by, he told me to stop. He reached down with his hands. She kind of lifted her arm. He grabbed a hold of her and then hooked on the back of her jacket and picked her up onto his boot and set her on his boot. And of course, he also told me, Don, my feet are getting wet back here. And the aircraft, when you transfer weight onto the aircraft, it's going to change the CG of the aircraft a little bit. So we went aft a little bit when we added about 120 pounds of soaking wet woman. As soon as he told me he had her, I headed right for shore, and we just slid in, dropped her, turned around, one to go. That one wasn't there. Yeah, we looked. We stayed at the fuselage for a little while looking.
And when we started rolling, I think the very first shot on my video is someone being loaded. There's a gurney with someone on it being loaded into the ambulance. And it must have been a man because he had large shoes. I came to learn later that was Bert Hamilton, was the first survivor out of the water. And he lived in Rockville. And I later learned also when I met his wife, probably weeks or months later, that she knew he was all right because she recognized his shoes. He was a big guy, and he had like large size 13 shoes. And when she saw his shoes sticking out in the gurney, she said, all right, at least he's out of the water. So that was one of those, remarkable stories you hear after the fact. Roger Oling was driving his pickup truck, and he was stuck in traffic on the 14th Street Bridge going into Virginia. And he worked at St. Elizabeth's in Southeast Washington. And I believe he saw the plane crash into the water and just left his truck on the bridge and ran down off of the bridge, down the embankment to the shoreline. And I guess other people like him had stopped, and they figured, well, they could see the survivors out in the water. And apparently, according to Roger, they tied ropes, battery cables, anything they had in the trunks of the car, they tied together. Roger tied it around his waist and jumped in the water and tried swimming out to the survivors. And he got pretty close to them, close enough that they were able to shout to each other. And I think at one point, I just recently read, he went back to the shoreline so they could lengthen the rope, went back towards the survivors. It was just amazing because we're talking freezing water now. I mean, the Potomac was frozen over. And again, he got near the survivors, but he told us later that he felt he was fading because he was in the cold water. He was wearing all his clothes. He was getting weighted down, and it was taking its toll on him. And then the helicopter showed up. And when Don and Gene showed up in Eagle One, they pulled Roger back to the shore. It was amazing. My hat's off to those guys. I mean, they went above and beyond, and they risked their lives doing that. And again, they used the helicopter in a way it was never designed to fly and maneuver. At one point, Don had the helicopter skids in the water with Gene standing on the skids, pulling Nikki Felch, the last survivor, out of the water, pulling her up out of the water onto the skids and basically holding on to her by the scruff of the neck. And just, she was the last one and probably in a really bad way. And it's just like, let's just get you out of the water. Those guys did an amazing job. And a lot of credit to them. I remarked to Don when I met him at the hangar years ago when Eagle One was being restored in the Park Police hangar. It was on display, and Don and I were there. We were chatting, and I admitted to him that at one point during the rescue, I believe it was when they had Nikki Felch on the skids of the helicopter, so she was the last one out of the water. To get her off the helicopter, off the skids, Don had to come down pretty low, and the shoreline was probably about 7 feet above the actual water. And the helicopter is going further and further down towards the water, and people are on the shoreline. And the lower he went towards the water, the blades were coming down lower. And if you look closely at the tape, when they're trying to get Nikki off the skids, I start backing up because I was convinced my soundman and I were going to be killed, that the helicopter blades were just going to cut us into little pieces. And that would be the end of it. And I remember remarking to myself, thinking, this could be the end, and I hope this tape survives. And nothing happened. And when I mentioned it to Don, he smiled. He said, "I saw you guys." He said, "I knew it was close, but I saw you guys." I said, "Well, I'm glad you saw us because I was really concerned."
One of the things that it did was to allow for a new level of collaboration, cooperation, coordination between various public safety entities that didn't exist before. Before Air Florida, fire departments, police departments in the Washington area and well beyond operated somewhat in silos. They were independent of each other. They didn't necessarily communicate with each other well. They didn't plan well together. They didn't execute well together. Air Florida changed that. In 30 minutes, that was a change, a quantum change in the way in which things happen. Now, that change did not occur in 30 minutes, but in 30 minutes' time, it laid the foundation for that change to occur over the next 10 years. Well, the greatest tribute to the souls that lost their lives that day was the fact that it evoked a lot of change, positive change that saved many, many other lives in the years to follow. So at least their lives being lost was not lives lost in vain.
About 2 years later, maybe a year and a half, I'm in my office and the secretary buzzes me and tells me that Gene Windsor, who was the paramedic, was out and had two individuals with him, a lady and family, and would I be able to see him? Well, I thought it was Gene's parents probably had come to visit him. Well, naturally, I was going to see him and greet him and say hi and how much we thought of Gene and what he had done. And to my surprise, I'm sitting at my desk, and on the right hand behind me is the American flag, and on the left hand behind me is the Park Police flag. And so this man and woman came in, and two little boys looked like twins. They couldn't have been, I'd say about 18 months old or something like that. And the lady stepped forward to shake my hand. She says, "Chief Herring, I'm the stewardess that was on Air Florida 90. And she says, I have two purposes. Number one, I wanted to meet you personally and thank you for the tough decision you had to make. And I'm very grateful to God that you made that decision." And she said, "This is my husband." And I said hello to him too. And she says, "These two little blonde-headed twin boys here would not be here today if I hadn't been saved from that Air Florida 90 crash." So she says, later result that happened since the Air Florida crash. Well, I was supposed to be the big chief and all, but I tell you, I got very emotional and tears. I saw those two kids and tears just came down my cheeks. And I've said softly to myself, thank you, God, for helping me make that decision.
I think the big lesson of that day is that people are generally good at heart. They want to help. When decent people see others in distress, they stop what they're doing and try to help. And that's what the civilians on the shoreline did. That's what Roger Olean did. That's what Lenny Skutnik did when he jumped in the water and saved Priscilla Tirado, who was about to drown. The helicopter crew, Don and Jean, they didn't have to fly, but that's their job, and they knew there's risk in their jobs, and they chose to jump in and help because they're good people. George and I were on the shoreline, and at one point I remember thinking to myself, when Priscilla Tirado was about to drown before Lenny saved her, I thought, this is not right. This woman is drowning in front of my camera. I need to put the camera down and do something. And I have no idea what I would have done, but it just seems so unfair that I'm videotaping her, which is my job and is not always pleasant. And when I looked around at one point, I kept on rolling, but I think I took my eye out of the viewfinder, and I kind of looked around, and it snapped me back to reality that there were people there, good people, doing what they could to help. So I thought, okay, just keep your wits about you, don't screw up, and just keep rolling. But I think the big lesson is people are generally good and they want to help.
To this day, I will tell you that any of the crews that would have been there would have gone out, and maybe it would have looked different, but in the end, everything would have still come out the same. They would have gone out, they would have battered their brains trying to figure out how to do things. They would have probably come to most of the same conclusions we did, done the same work, and it would have just been a Park Police helicopter with two guys in blue flight suits out there working their butts off, trying to get the job done.
Like I said, it was indeed a day for the ages. In fact, when you visit the museum, you can see some of the footage that Chester Panzer recorded standing in the snow that day. One of the responsibilities and opportunities of a museum like ours is to tell stories like these, to preserve and present artifacts that help us better understand what's come before and, as a result, who we are today. One of my favorite artifacts in the National Law Enforcement Museum is Eagle One, which you can see behind me. We just heard amazing stories of this very helicopter, and in the museum, we can see this piece of history for ourselves. Let's learn even more about this famous helicopter from one of the people responsible for bringing it to our museum, Russ Matthews.
I was 13 years old when the Air Florida crash happened. And I can remember that. I can remember seeing it on the news. I can remember the emotion of that, of seeing that horrible crash and the aftermath of it, and also just the exhilaration of the image of Lenny Skutnik jumping into the water to save Priscilla Tirado, and watching that whole scene unfold. In the days before everyone was carrying a video camera with them, to actually watch history unfold was very unusual. And that footage that Chester Panzer captured is so powerful. And about actually 15 years ago, so 2007, I saw a documentary about the Air Florida crash on the Weather Channel, of all things, and it included that footage. And from that perspective, watching it, I was still riveted. Your heart is in your throat, like watching this and watching, that helicopter, and the way that Don Usher, was flying it that day. You can see, especially there's the moments when it approaches the riverbank, and you can see just how close the rotors are coming to that slope and how expertly he's maneuvering it. And then just that heart-stopping moment when the landing skids actually go underwater, when they pull the last survivor out of the water. It is a moment when the skill and the courage and the technology kind of all came together, and it made all the difference in the world for 5 people. And so I remember seeing that doc again, watching that footage, and the thought comes into my mind, could that helicopter still exist? Could it still be out there somewhere? And things tend to hang around in general aviation for a long time. So I thought, well, there's a chance. And I brought it up to some other people, some other friends of mine that are also interested in historic preservation. A guy named Art Rapinski knew a lot more about Googling than I did in those days. I'm not even sure it was Google then. It might have been, Bing or Ask Jeeves. I don't know how he did it, but he found an article that talked about this historic helicopter that had been used in the rescue. Eagle One had now moved out, and was now serving out in the West with the Bureau of Reclamation. So it still was out there, still soldiering on. So this helicopter had just been transferred out there and was now, keeping track of water levels in the Pacific Northwest and the lower Colorado River region. So it was part of the year in Flagstaff and part of the year at Boise, Idaho. And as it turns out, my family, we spend some time in the summers in Boise, Idaho. So I reached out. There was a friend of mine who's an archaeologist who does a lot of work with the National Park Service, which is also part of the Department of Interior. So he was able to connect me with the people out in Boise who, managed the helicopter. And I got in contact with them and asked, could I come and see it? And they were totally agreeable. And so I went out to a hangar in Boise, Idaho, August 1st, 2007. It was my mom's birthday. And, they took me into the hangar, and there it was. And you would never have known to look at it that this was Eagle One. It was, they'd repainted it in the meantime. It was in this very nondescript kind of white, red, and gold trim paint scheme, and they changed the call sign, so it was N613 now. But the people at the Bureau of Reclamation knew what they had. So the regional pilot was the one who took me to look at the helicopter, and I remember him taking me over to the left side door, and the latch that you use to open it gets a lot of use. So the latch had been the paint had been scuffed off the top edge, and underneath you could see the blue paint. So you knew this is Eagle One. This is the one right here. So in this hangar in Boise, Idaho. And for me, I'd spent a lot of time at that point on expeditions in the South Pacific and, just kind of remote areas of the woods in Maine and Newfoundland looking for lost aircraft. And I'd also been involved with, some efforts to preserve some historic ships. And the thing is, a lot of times those kinds of projects, you are called to action because either the ship or the plane is on its way to the junkyard, or it's been on the bottom of the ocean for the last 80 years. And so this was a time where the idea was, well, can we get ahead of the curve? Can we find this thing out there still serving on, and then arrange that when it finally ends its service life, that you can arrange just a smooth transition into an honorable retirement. And it was what actually the friend of mine that had connected me with the Park Service, he termed it preventative archaeology. So so that was the thought is, can we find someplace that'll be ready to accept this when it's done its service. So Eagle One back there it's a Bell 206 Long Ranger. And it's a great design. It's been manufactured for decades. As an object, as an aviation artifact, it's unremarkable. What makes it special is what was done with it, what the crew did when it really mattered. And so I got to thinking, well, if its place isn't in aviation history, where is it? And it said, well, then I thought, what about police history? So I called another friend. This one was a retired police captain in my hometown in Princeton, New Jersey, a guy named Mario Musso. And I asked him, is there a National Police Museum? And at the time, again, this is 15 years ago, he said, well, no, but they're building one. And I was, oh, that's interesting. So by this time, I'd learned to do a little bit of Googling for myself and discovered that, the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial was going to develop a National Law Enforcement Officers Museum in D.C. And it's like, are you kidding me? That's only a few miles from the spot where, this helicopter had made history. So I reached out, online. I contacted a woman by the name of Lori Beatty and brought it to her attention that this was still out there, and this object that had, such an incredible place in police history, was still out there and still available. And could we put in the process, put in the mechanisms that would see it preserved. So that was, I guess, sort of the first domino to fall, and there was a lot more to go from there. That's my personal perspective. I know that a lot of people and a lot of organizations had to come together, to make things happen, from that point on. And I remember getting an email with an attachment, and it had a rendering that showed Eagle One suspended from the ceiling in the main atrium. Like it basically, it would be the first thing you see when you walk into the museum, and I couldn't think of a better spot for it. I just, from that moment of, could it still be out there, and is there a way to save it? I don't even think at that time I imagined a better, more fitting spot than where it is actually right now, right behind me. One of the things I really like about this is that I feel like Eagle One is about the purest expression of what it really means to be a peace officer, to put your life on the line for others, for people you've never met. And that's what Don Usher and Gene Windsor did that day. You watch the tape, and and it strikes you actually the same way that it struck one of the survivors. He talked about he was in the water, that freezing water, and looking around and realizing, I just survived a plane crash, and now I'm going to die with 1,000 people looking on. Because he was in the middle of this frozen river, terrible injuries, blinded by jet fuel, with basically freezing to death with seemingly no hope at all. And then, here's the sound of rotor blades of the chopper, coming through the storm to the rescue. And yeah, it's really something to put yourself in that place. And it was something that hit me when they first raised the helicopter to the ceiling, was that when it got above my head, I'd never seen it from below before. You saw the detail of the helicopter, but you realized, that was the first sight that the people in the water had of this coming for them. And to be there in that spot and to be able to view the videotape and put yourself in that spot is remarkable. And that's what these objects do. They are touchstones to the past. The stuff that was there then that is still here now. And it takes very little imagination to stand in their presence and put yourself back in those stories and in that experience. And it's something that these objects will speak, when the people who were part of it no longer can, and will speak to generations to come and inspire them for what's possible and what we can be for each other. So,
we've now heard about January 13th, 1982. We've taken to the air to see the route and to glimpse a rare view of Washington, D.C. And we've learned about the journey for Eagle One to land in our museum. 40 years ago, the primary tools used during the rescue were a tow rope and a simple ring like this, called a throw buoy, not even intended to fit a person. Now, this isn't the actual ring they used back then, but it was given to the museum by the U.S. Park Police and makes shockingly real the lack of specialized equipment at their disposal. So, what about today? What does the aviation look like for the U.S. Park Police now, 40 years on from the rescue? For our concluding segment, we're heading to the Eagle's Nest, the aviation hangar for the U.S. Park Police. There we'll get a tour of the current Eagle One to see how it's different from this helicopter from 1982. We'll see a demonstration of some of the current safety and rescue equipment used by the Park Police. And we'll speak with Acting Commander of the Aviation Section, Sergeant Timothy P. Ryan, to better understand how the section's work has changed in the 40 years since the rescue.
Primary mission equipment in terms of technology is going to be our FLIR camera. The FLIR camera allows us to do a couple of things. It allows us to fly at night and be able to see what's on the ground using infrared technology. It also provides daycam technology, which means we use it as a video feed. And that video feed can then be transferred down to ground units so they can get an idea of what we're seeing from up above. Okay. The next piece back is going to be our tracker beam. That is, essentially, it's a giant flashlight. And what we can use that for is to light up large crime scenes, incident scenes. If we are looking for somebody in the woods, a lost person, missing person, we can use that to kind of give our guys on the ground a better view of what's going on. This side of the helicopter is our rescue side. So what we're doing over here is any kind of rescue work, any kind of tactical work. What we have on this side is our Coast Guard rescue basket. We also have tethers so that our personnel are secure when they're working with the doors open. And then our primary means of evacuating people is going to be a hoist. So this is our hoist cable and our hoist housing. And what we can do is lower down rescue equipment to people on the ground and be able to bring them back up to the helicopter. This is the patient care side of the helicopter. We can be outfitted to take 2 patients, but most often it's going to be a single patient transport. This is our patient cot, so we'll take the patient, put them on the cot, make sure they're secure before we take off. And then we have all the medical equipment that you would expect to find in an ambulance. We have cardiac monitors, intubation equipment, advanced medications to make sure that we can take care of the patient on the way to the hospital. This is the co-pilot side of the helicopter, or where the rescue technician sits. The equipment that you're seeing up here is going to be a couple of monitors that we use to keep track of what's going on with our FLIR camera and our other cameras. There's also dual controls, so we can fly 2 pilots if we need to. Rescue Tech also has access to 5 different radio channels, so we can have as many as 5 different conversations going on with various partner agencies on the ground and with our own people on the ground. So one of our primary means of rescuing people is the Coast Guard Rescue Basket. It's a collapsible basket, so it fits neatly inside the helicopter and it can be quickly assembled and then deployed as needed. We primarily use it for people who are less injured than others that simply are stuck into place and can't get out, or have minor injuries that prevent them from walking out but still need to be evacuated from the area. So the Coast Guard Rescue Basket gets dropped down. The victim is either climbs in on their own or is assisted into the basket, and then we hoist them right up. One of the features of this are the floats that are attached to the side. So it's also useful for water rescues. It can be dropped into the water, and it was designed to float just above the water line or just below the water line so that the person in the water can swim into the basket and then be hoisted back up. One of the more specialized pieces that we carry on the helicopter is called a jungle penetrator. It was designed to go through thick foliage and canopy to get down to people that are on the ground. We primarily use it to deploy trained personnel or to recover trained personnel from the ground. We wouldn't really use this in a rescue situation for a victim. The way it works, essentially, the seats fold down. There's a secure strap to wrap around. And it can be cinched up tightly around the rescuer, and it can be brought back up to the helicopter. One of the more unique pieces we have, it's not used all that often, but it's a very valuable piece in certain situations. It's called a rescue strap. It's very similar to a cinch collar, but it has an additional piece, a strap that goes through the legs and connects in front to add a little bit extra safety to it. So basically the rescuer would go down, extract a person who may be stuck in the water, out on the rocks, up in a tree, something like that, where they couldn't get out on their own, but are unable to get into a rescue basket. So a rescuer would go down, put this around the patient, cinch it up, connect the rescue strap underneath, and then we would hoist the victim up straight up to the helicopter. This is one of our more important pieces and one of our more commonly used pieces. This is called a Stokes Basket. We use this for patients that are more seriously injured, patients that may have spinal injuries or long bone fractures that can't be moved, can't get in and out of a basket, and really can't be extricated any other way. So they would be strapped to a backboard, secured inside the Stokes Basket, and then hoisted up to the helicopter, maintaining this in a horizontal way so the patient doesn't tip in or out. We maintain control of this Stokes Basket with tag lines. So we would attach 200-foot ropes to 2 points on the basket, and those ropes would be tended by personnel on the ground to keep the basket from spinning around on us. Again, these are used for our more seriously injured patients. The most important consideration in any kind of rescue operation is safety, not only for the people on the ground, but also for our people on board. In order to ensure that we're operating safely, we have several pieces of equipment that we all wear that are required for our personnel. The most important is going to be the rescue vest. The rescue vest is designed to provide a couple of benefits. Most importantly, it provides retention inside the helicopter. So once this thing is fully secured, and you can see it takes a couple minutes to get in here until you practice with it. This is a fully rated climbing harness. So our personnel can be hoisted from the aircraft down to a victim and then hoisted right back up again, simply by attaching this carabiner to the hook. Another component of this vest that's really important is a personal flotation device. It's incorporated into the vest so it's flat, doesn't get in the way while we're working. But if we need to go into an aquatic environment, if we need to jump in the water to rescue somebody, or if we wind up in the water in another manner, this can be deployed in order to keep our people safe and afloat. Another important component is protecting our heads, obviously. So we all wear flight helmets. These flight helmets also incorporate our intercom system. So once we get into the helicopter, we plug into the intercom system in the helicopter, and then we're able to talk to each other, drowning out all the sort of ambient noise that goes on up there. Another piece of equipment that we use is going to be our flight gloves. These are just regular flight gloves, so we use these for most of our operations. So if we're doing law enforcement or searches or presidential missions, anything where we're not doing actual rescue work, we're just going to use regular flight gloves. Once we move into an operational position where we're actually doing rescues and doing hoist work, the hoist cable can be kind of difficult on your hands, so we need extra protection to do that. So we use heavy-duty gloves in order to protect ourselves while we're working with the hoist. My name is Sergeant Timothy Ryan. I'm the acting commander of the United States Park Police Aviation Unit. So our primary focus is to provide support for the United States Park Police. That incorporates law enforcement, so searches, surveillance, that kind of stuff. We do medevacs here in the District of Columbia and also in the state of Maryland and Virginia. We do search and rescue primarily at Great Falls and out in Shenandoah, as well as urban search and rescue as well. And we also do presidential and foreign dignitary protection. So anytime the president moves in the area, we provide reconnaissance to make sure the route is safe for him. We actually go pretty far out. So we've gone as far as New Orleans to support operations in support of Hurricane Katrina, and also up to New York to support Superstorm Sandy, the operations up there as well. So our typical service areas in the Washington metropolitan area, that includes Maryland and Virginia as well. We can go up to 50 statute miles from the White House on our own, just to respond to whatever need there is. If we want to go a little bit further than that, like out to Shenandoah or Western Maryland, we just need to get permission from the shift commander.
Tell us about how your work today is influenced by what happened with the Air Florida rescue 40 years ago.
A lot of the operations that we do right now can be traced directly back to the mission that they flew on that day. Civilian helicopters weren't typically used in search and rescue operations, certainly not in rescue operations back then. They opened the door for people to look at us in a different light. Instead of just being an eye in the sky, people realized that the helicopter could be used in different applications. So it really opened the door for us to do search and rescue operations, hoist operations, and medevacs. That really sort of opened the door and paved the way for us. Helicopters really weren't used in that application back then. There's an anecdotal story, I can only assume that it's true, that during a static display where we take the helicopter out and talk to people and explain what we do, Don had been asked the question just a couple weeks prior to that whether or not we did river rescues. And his response was, no, we don't do that. That's just TV stuff. But it sort of speaks to the ethos that they had, and we think still kind of governs what we do here, that our mission is our mission, but as things come along, we try to adapt to accomplish whatever mission comes our way. So sort of the most high profile things that we've been involved in, clearly Air Florida is sort of the one that everybody thinks about. We also played a significant role in the response to the Pentagon on 9/11. And we also were involved heavily with evacuations and rescues over at the Washington Navy Yard. We also did medevacs at the congressional baseball team shooting. So we've been involved in a lot of high profile things. But honestly, the ones that stick with me the most, the ones that I think about, are the rescues that we do on the river or up in Shenandoah or in other places as well, where we're just, it's an isolated individual rescue where you get somebody back up board and they look at you and they realize that you've sort of gotten them out of a bad position. And that's really sort of what drives us to do what we do here. The biggest thing that we want people to understand is that we're here to help.
We are a law enforcement agency. Our job is law enforcement. That's what we're here to support. But we train extensively to get into this job, and we train on an ongoing basis to be able to perform additional tasks. So medevacs, search and rescues, hoist rescues, all that kind of stuff. We're a law enforcement agency, but we also have important components that sort of support that mission in a way that people might not be familiar with and might not recognize.
Thank you to all those who participated in this program and for sharing your stories. Eagle One, always watching over us at the museum, is a reminder of what's best in the story of American law enforcement. It helps us consider the ways law enforcement serves creatively, responds to new challenges, overcomes adversity, and ultimately seeks to save lives. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to visit our website, where you'll find a new online exhibit that offers a broader look at law enforcement aviation and airborne public safety. We owe a debt of gratitude to Roger Connor, curator of vertical flight at the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum, for guest curating this online exhibit with our museum's curator, Lily Catherine Ames. You'll find a link to that exhibit on our homepage at lawenforcementmuseum.org. Thanks again to Russ Matthews for your continued support of this program and of our new online exhibit, and a very special thanks to the United States Park Police for your efforts in helping make today's program possible. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining us today. You can find more content from the museum on our website and social media channels. And when you're in Washington, D.C., please visit us in person and see Eagle One for yourself. Don't forget to stick around for some bonus footage, a sneak preview of D.C. from the air, including our very own National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial and Museum. Farewell, and thank you to all of the law enforcement officers out there. Be safe.